I love that Bob and Kelly are here during this series because we're looking at the book of Acts. And the book of Acts really is this account of the church, of people, of common people, regular people who are truly animated and activated by the Holy Spirit. And I think they're just such great living examples of this, of God just saying, hey, this is what I want you to do. And they were like, okay, here we go. We're going to go do this. And truly, those of you that know Bob and Kelly, this is like, wow, you guys are doing what? And here they are 2 years later. And it's really an amazing thing. And it so much aligns with what our heart is behind this series. We've been walking through this book that it's a history of the church, but at the same time, it's revealing the origins of the church. And I love that it's revealing our origins because those origins really tell us what we're supposed to be. So if you're a Christian or Christ follower, when we look at the book of Acts and we see things happening, we see things taking place, it really provides for us sort of an architectural blueprint for where we're moving as Christ followers, for the heart of God for us, for what life could and maybe should look like for us. If you're not a Christ follower, it also probably answers some questions, because I think oftentimes people in today's culture can look at the church and go, man, is that really what Jesus had intended? And I love looking at the book of Acts because I can say, no, actually that's what Jesus had intended. So whether you're a Christ follower or not a Christ follower, I think studying the book of Acts has very genuine benefit for us because it reveals what authentic Christianity really is supposed to look like. So tonight we're going to be continuing in chapter 4 of the book of Acts. If you have a Bible, you can open up there. But before we actually dive into that, I just want to go backwards for a moment and connect something that this last week just really came back to me. I found myself back in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 has some seismic spiritual events that take place in it that are very significant. In fact, just the background of this, if you haven't been here for this series, in the beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus is with his disciples. This is after the resurrection, like 40 days with his disciples. And after the resurrection, he gives them very specific instructions. And he says, I want you to go into the city of Jerusalem. I don't want you to leave Jerusalem. And that wasn't their home. The disciples were from Galilee. They were from other regions. And so Jesus says, I want you to stay in Jerusalem. And I want you to wait because I've promised you my Spirit. I'm going to pour out my Spirit. It will be this incredibly dynamic moment that will be life-changing for you and for everyone around you. I've promised you my Spirit, but I want you to wait there. So the disciples go to Jerusalem. They wait. They're praying. On the day of Pentecost, which is an annual feast of the Jews, the disciples are praying in the upper room, and they're together. And there's this moment that's described in verse 2 of Acts chapter 2, where it says literally, and suddenly there was a sound from heaven. This week I was just looking at this sentence and looking at it and thinking about it in the language that it was originally written in, which was Greek. This word sound is the word echoes. Echoes is where we get in our English language the word echo, fairly obvious there, right? So the word echo or echoes. And I was just thinking about the idea of an echo and the sound that's being played in this moment, what's being heard here. When we think about an echo in our culture, essentially it's this. It's very simple. There is a sound that is initiated, and then that sound reverberates off of a variety of objects, and what you may be hearing down the line is the reverberations or the outcomes of a sound that was initiated somewhere else. In this case, what we have is an echo. We have a sound that is reverberating, but it originated in heaven, it says. There was a sound from heaven. It's like an echo, something that initiates with God and is now moving into this moment, moving into this space that these individuals are occupying. What we're hearing, what they're hearing, is the sound of heaven reverberating. There's something that's happening in this moment. And this echo is described in a very particular way. You read the rest of the verse, there's this sound like a mighty rushing wind. And this is really significant because the word wind, whenever a biblical author uses the word wind, it is typically used in reference to the power or the movement of God in a spiritual dynamic sort of way. The Hebrews in the Old Testament use the word ruach to describe the wind of God. The Greek word is the word pneuma. Both of those words speak to the wind of God. Now, the reason they chose wind to describe the power of God moving was simply because wind was this physical illustration of power that was unseen, but power that was real. There was a power that was tangible in wind, right? When the wind blows, you feel it even though it's unseen. Even though you can't actually see it and observe it with your eyes, you can feel the force of it. And so they used the word wind to describe the power of God because there was a known force. God was moving. The room would be electric. There'd be this sense of his presence and his power, and yet it was completely unseen. So what we have in this moment is this sound like a rushing wind. It is an echo of heaven, and it is powerful. And so the room in this moment in Acts chapter 2, it's electric. They feel something. There is this echo. There is this noise from heaven. And what we're reading in this moment is not just a room being filled with the presence of God, but we're seeing the disciples themselves being filled with the presence of God. They're being bathed in the presence of God. They're being covered in the presence of God. God is coming upon them in a very unique way. And so in this moment, there is this echo from heaven. There is this power that's being spread. There is this electricity to the room. And these disciples in this moment are becoming living echoes of heaven. They're becoming conduits of the wind that is moving. They themselves are now participating in this. In a sense, we could say that these individuals now become themselves the sound of the wind. Their lives are now the sound of the wind because of what's happening in Acts chapter 2. They are echoes of the power and the presence of God, which means there is something that is different about them now, right? Like, it doesn't take much of an education to realize that if this is happening to you, if the Spirit of God is on you, if he's moving in your life in this sort of dynamic way, then you will be a transformed person, right? There's going to be something different. There are going to be tangible effects on you. When the sound of heaven, when the power of God begins to reverberate in your life, when the wind or the breath of God begins to blow through you and move in you, there are going to be implications. It's unavoidable. And not just in your life for your own personal experience, right? I mean, obviously, there's a dynamic of this that if God is moving in you and you experience God's presence, God's movement, there's something that's very satisfying personally. There might be joy. There might be peace. There might be a sense of contentedness. Maybe even an awakening in your soul. There might be something you experience and you say, man, I'm experiencing this on a personal level. But then also in this moment, what we see is that not only do we experience this personally, not only do we see this ourselves, but the Spirit coming upon an individual causes individuals to live beyond themselves. And so we see that in this text, but we see that in our lives today. You actually become a person who lives beyond yourself. Your life extends now into areas that it didn't previously extend into places, into experiences, into relationships, and you begin to live beyond what you would live if you were left to your own devices. That is the power of God in our lives. He takes this place and does things with us that we would not do without him. You become an echo of the sound. You become a living example of the sound. So in Acts chapter 2, when this happens, there's a crowd that gathers. There's a group of people that they hear this sound. They see what's happening. The power of God is moving. And so there's a crowd that gathers around the disciples. What we see is that this reverberating of the echo, this carrying on of God's power and his movement, it continues to have the same effect. As you move through the book of Acts, over and over again, what we see is God moving, and we see crowds gathering around the disciples. In fact, it's not just in the book of Acts, but it's throughout the history of the church that when the Spirit of God is moving among a group of people, crowds gather to see and to hear and to find out what it would take to be a part of what people are experiencing. That's just the nature of how things have worked for centuries as God's Spirit moves among God's people. Now, that's exactly what's happening in Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4 is sort of a recurrence of this same dynamic. It's a reverberation of this same reality. So last week, if you were here in chapter 3, John Pemberton took us through chapter 3, which is, there's a situation where John and Peter heal an individual, and this healing is so dramatic that it causes a crowd to gather, right? The power of God is exhibited, the presence of God is made known, and so there's a crowd that gathers, and people are listening to what these individuals have to say. Peter preaches a sermon, and when you get to chapter 4, where we're starting today, it's really what happens after Peter completes these words that he's spoken to these individuals. So if you have your Bible, Acts chapter 4, verse 1, if you don't, the words are on the screen. We're going to read this. We're just going to read what happens, and then we're going to walk back through it and talk about some of the dynamics of what's taking place here. So chapter 4, verse 1 says, "And as they were speaking to the people," so Peter is finished talking, they're talking to all these people, the crowd. It says, "The priests and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees, they came upon them greatly annoyed, because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who had heard the word believed, and the number of the men came to about 5,000. On the next day, their rulers and elders and scribes gathered together in Jerusalem with Annas the high priest, Caiaphas and John and Alexander, and all who were of the high priestly family. And when they had set them in the midst, they inquired, 'By what power or by what name do you do this?'" Right? What is the cause of this reverberation? Right? What is happening? What is this sound that we're hearing? And then it says, "Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, 'Rulers of the people and elders, if we are being examined today concerning a good deed done to a crippled man, by what means this man has been healed, let it be known to all of you, to all the people of Israel, that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man is standing before you well. This Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved.'" Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished. And they recognized that they'd been with Jesus. But seeing the man who was healed standing beside them, they had nothing to say in opposition. But when they had commanded them to leave the council, they conferred with one another, saying, "What shall we do with these men? For that a notable sign has been performed through them is evident to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. But in order that it may spread no further among the people, let us warn them to speak no more to anyone in this name." So they called them and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, "Whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard." And when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding no way to punish them because of the people. For all were praising God for what had happened. For the man on whom this sign of healing was performed was more than 40 years old, right? Like, he was an old guy, and God did stuff with him, right? Apparently that was shocking back then, right? He's old. He's over 40, but God does stuff with people over 40, apparently. Now, in this, I want us to consider just for a moment some of the things that are happening here, because part of what's taking place here translate very specifically to our cultural setting today and what we're experiencing. The text basically says this. It says that as Peter and John were speaking to the people, that the priests, the captain of the temple guard, the Sadducees, that they came upon them. In other words, they basically came to seize them. And it says that they were greatly annoyed. How many of you know what it means to be greatly annoyed with someone? Yeah, we don't need a Greek word or a translation for that one, right? We all know greatly annoyed. How many of you have been greatly annoyed today at some point, right? Greatly annoyed is something we're familiar with. These individuals are greatly annoyed with Peter and John. The question is why? Why are they annoyed with them? Well, the next verse says, kind of clearly, it says, because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. But why is that so upsetting to these individuals? Why does that bother them? Why would it cause them to arrest them and to take them into captivity and to question them and to do all these things? Why would they do this? In fact, this is really interesting when you think about it, because most of the people that were listening were very receptive to the message of Jesus, but here we have this group that's at the other end of the spectrum, and they're greatly annoyed by this message. What would cause people to be so greatly annoyed by Jesus being proclaimed the way they were proclaiming him? If you go back to chapter 3, and you look at what Peter was preaching, the reason they were annoyed was this. Peter was preaching that Jesus was the Messiah, but he was a Messiah that came and died and was resurrected and ascended into heaven. And then Peter's preaching in chapter 3, he says that at some point in the future, Jesus will return for the purpose of restoring and renewing all things. Basically saying this, that the Messiah was one who would bring justice in the world, that injustice would be eradicated, that suffering would be dealt with, that brokenness would no longer be a part of the human experience, that death would be eradicated. Basically, human flourishing on every single level would be made possible in the future by Jesus. And I know the first thought is, why would anybody object to that? Well, they object to what he says in verse 25 of chapter 3. In that particular verse, Peter says that Jesus is going to do this, but he's going to do this for all nations. And that's where they have a problem. Because these particular religious leaders that we're reading about, these guys that are greatly annoyed, they had a very specific agenda as it related to the Messiah. They believed in a Messiah. They wanted a Messiah, but what they wanted was a political Messiah. What they were hoping for was a Messiah that would overthrow the Roman occupation, a Messiah that would come and allow them to be the nation that they were established to be. In other words, what they were hoping for was sort of a personal Jesus, a personal Messiah, somebody who would accomplish what they wanted Jesus to accomplish. Like, we have our agenda and we want a Messiah that will do our thing. And when Peter is proclaiming that Jesus is going to bless all the nations, including this occupying nation, including people that were formerly excluded by the Jews, that's incredibly offensive to them. You are now presenting a truth about the Messiah that is not a truth that we believe in. And so there's conflict in this. It's infuriating for these leaders. And in some ways, what's happening in this text is exactly what's happening in our culture today, which this is good for us to understand that Christianity was birthed in a cosmopolitan culture very much like ours, highly educated and highly pluralistic, very much like this one. And Jesus is being proclaimed in a way by the apostles that is in conflict with the prevailing or existing system of thinking in this moment, but also in future moments. We see the conflict with the Jewish leaders and their idea of the Messiah, but then as the gospel begins to spread, and you read this in the book of Acts, as the gospel goes out into the Roman Empire, which is incredibly pluralistic, all of these different religious systems were being employed and encouraged by various people. As the gospel goes out, it comes into conflict with all of these prevailing systems, all of these faith systems or religious ideologies that existed, these philosophies. All of these things are coming in conflict with the gospel or the message of Jesus. Because the Jesus that's being presented by the apostles is a Jesus who presents a way for us to relate to God that is unlike anything that any other religious system had ever presented before. So it's completely new. It's completely different. And essentially, it eradicates the need for religiosity and the systems themselves. So Jesus is essentially eradicating truths that people have been holding on to for the course of generations. And that creates conflict, right? Anytime you have two people who hold two opposing truths, there's going to be conflict. I have children. And sometimes I watch my daughters, my children, they get in some debates every now and then over things, and I hear this like, that's not true. No, this is what's true. No, that's not true. That's not what happened. No, this is what happened. And then like sometimes I have to get in and like call a timeout. I'm like, okay, give me your stories. Tell me what's going on. Because two people with two opposing views of truth are going to have conflict, right? Ask anyone that's married and they'll tell you, yes, this is true, right? That's what causes conflict. So the truth of Jesus, the truth of who he is, the truth of what he does, it supersedes. It comes in conflict with the value systems that are driving people's behaviors then and now. It supersedes. It's in conflict with the systems that culture has set up for how we discover meaning and purpose in our lives, how we find joy and happiness in our lives. All of those things that are driving how people live, all of those principles that are guiding the direction of their lives, all of those things then and now are confronted by the message and the ministry of Jesus. And people get greatly annoyed by this. Like some of you right now, you're feeling a little annoyed, right? And you say, yeah, actually, that's the part of this whole Christianity thing that drives me a little nuts, is that sometimes Jesus messes with my stuff, right? He messes with my world a little bit. He messes with my values. And we become greatly annoyed. They did then, and they do today. See, We live in a society today, this is the prevailing view in our society today. We live in a society today that says that you can't say these things about Jesus. These things that were being said here, in our culture, it's exactly the same. You can't say this about Jesus. You can't say who he even says he is, right? You can't repeat Jesus' own definition of himself in our culture today because that comes in conflict with other worldviews, right? Or maybe it comes in conflict with my worldview. And so you can't say that because that conflicts with my understanding of how life operates. See, we live in a time where we have to validate every other religion or every other philosophy or every other way of living life. We live in a time where you can no longer claim that you have some sort of truth that is a prevailing truth that supersedes another truth. You have to validate every other system. That's the prevailing system of today. Like anyone that makes a truth claim, that's really a thing of the past. You can't really do that anymore. But even that statement, if you think logically about this for just a moment, even that statement, even that sort of proclamation that you can't claim to have ultimate truth is itself a claim to ultimate truth, right? I mean, the moment you tell me something, and even if it's to say there isn't ultimate truth, that statement is an overriding statement. And so we violate that principle by stating it alone. You telling me that I can't believe something is a truth claim in itself, especially as it relates to Jesus. And here's why. Let me just explain this about Jesus. If you say, listen, Brad, you can believe in Jesus, like you can follow his teachings, but you can't claim his superiority. If you can't say that Jesus is like above these other systems, if he's outside of these systems, if he supersedes, you can believe in him, you just can't say that. If that's what you tell me, if you say, listen, you have to follow his teachings just like other people follow the teachings of other prophets or religious leaders. If that's what you tell me, like Jesus isn't better than any other religious leader that ever existed. If you tell me that, then what you're truly telling me is that I can't believe in Jesus. And here's why. Because Jesus makes these claims about himself. Those are things that I've come up with. The Jesus that I believe in, the Jesus that I proclaim personally, I did not come up with these ideas of who Jesus is. In fact, Jesus is the one that came up with who Jesus is. He's the one that presents himself in a particular way. The apostles didn't come up with an idea of who Jesus is. Jesus came up with an idea of who Jesus is. And so I get my idea, they get their idea, we all get our idea of who Jesus is from Jesus himself. He's the one that actually makes the truth claims about himself. You read the scriptures, you read his biographies, and there is just overwhelming evidence of these claims that Jesus makes about his divinity and who he is. So for me to believe something other than what he himself claims to be means that I'm actually not believing in Jesus. I can't be believing in Jesus if I don't actually take his claims seriously. Just recently, I was in a conversation with a good friend of mine. One of my best friends also happens to be a fairly committed atheist, and he has been for the whole course of our friendship. And it's an incredibly respectful relationship. He's one of my really, really good friends, and he's like a member of my family, and my girls love him, and my family, like we just do life together. And we have really amazing conversations. And recently, he called me one day and just said, hey, I need to talk to you. I got some questions I want to run past you. And so we met together and we kind of chit-chatted for about 30 seconds. And he said, come on, we just need to cut to the chase. And he throws this question at me, kind of like out of the blue. I didn't see it coming. And he just says to me this. He says, could I be an atheist and still follow the teachings of Jesus? And I was like, man, great question, right? Great question, right? And genuinely, I appreciated it. When he asked this question, I appreciated the fact that he's thinking about these things and really thinking about why was he asking this? We've had some conversations around spirituality and truth and these sort of things, but I was thinking, why does he ask this? He's asking it ultimately because for him, he's got a few friends that are passionate followers of Jesus. He's got a few friends that are authentic followers of Jesus. And I truly believe the motivation was this. He's looking at their lives and he's saying, I sort of like what I see. I like the outcomes of what I see in these people. The people that are around me that are Jesus followers are also people that I genuinely just like to be around. And so I really think the logic was sort of this. If I follow the teachings of Jesus, will I experience the same outcomes as you're experiencing? And so he's just simply saying, can I be an atheist? Do I have to actually believe in the existence of God? Or can I just follow Jesus' teachings philosophically? And I love this. I love the line of thinking. I love where he was going, and it really led to a greater conversation. I can't get into all the details, but I'll just share this, that I was able to explain to my friend that at the core of who Jesus is not some sort of ethical or moral code. That Jesus is not about a philosophy that we're following or an ideology that we're adhering to, but at the core of who Jesus is this thing that Jesus accomplishes. Jesus is opening up an opportunity for human beings to live in relationship with God. That the greatest dynamic of what Jesus does is he allows us to become echoes of the wind of God. We become the sound of God in the world around us. We begin to live in relationship with God. We have moments like we read about with Peter where God is moving in our lives and he's animating us and he's activating us and he's doing those sorts of things. So at the core of what Jesus is about, it's not his teachings, it's what he accomplishes. It's what he does in us. It's what he does through us, and it absolutely is dependent on the existence of a God who is real and a God who relates to us. And so the conversation kind of went on, and it was a really, really beautiful thing. But whether it's in this text where the gospel is confronting the exclusive Messiah of the Jews, or the pluralism of the Roman Empire, or the pluralism in our own culture today, the message and the ministry of Jesus has always created conflict. It's always been an offense to certain people at some level. That's what happens when a truth claim is made. Now, at the same time, people then and people today still believe. Why? There's this moment in verse 12 when Peter gives a summary statement of the teaching of Jesus. And he says something that really is a summary of what Jesus said. He just says that there's no other name under heaven by which men can be saved. And that statement says it all. What's he really saying? He's saying, listen, there's no other name that is proclaimed by humanity by which individuals can truly be saved. He's saying, listen, there is something deeper that anyone could ever claim verbally with their mouth in this present world. There's no other name that could be given that can accomplish what Jesus can accomplish. Jesus does something that no other teaching, no other philosophy could ever accomplish. That doesn't mean that we can't appreciate other teachings. It doesn't mean we can't respect other philosophies. But there's something about what Jesus says. There's something about what Jesus does that is deeper. Jesus has the ability to reach us at our deepest level of human need. He transforms us at a level that is completely different than any other philosophy, any other teaching, any other religion. He meets us at the core of who we are, our deepest needs as human beings. That's what he does. And you see that Jesus says things about himself and what he does to the human heart that nobody else says. Nobody says the things that Jesus says about himself. In fact, that alone leaves us with only two possibilities for Jesus. Either Jesus is not the Son of God, which if that's the case, if Jesus' claims about himself are not true, then he is, in that case, inferior to every other religious system or philosophy that it's ever been proclaimed. And I say that because of this. If Jesus is not correct about that, then every other religious teacher who didn't make a claim to deity actually, therefore, was more enlightened and had more perspective on the world than Jesus did. If Jesus made false claims to deity, then he's actually inferior to every other religious system because Jesus claims something here, and if that's not true, then he has to be here. He cannot be on the equal plane. So either Jesus is not the Son of God and therefore inferior to every other religious system, or Jesus is exactly who he says he is. He's exactly who he says he is. To believe in Jesus at all means we have to believe in his superiority, the fact that he is above, beyond, that he supersedes any other religious system. It's an implication of believing in Jesus. It's like this assumption that goes along with his name. And when you believe that, it changes you. It does something to you as a person. When you look at the text we're looking at tonight, you see the problem these leaders are having. It's very obvious, right? You're teaching a philosophy, you're proclaiming a truth that comes in conflict with our truth. But there's something about what they see that creates another sort of conflict with them. They might have issue with the message of Jesus, but notice what this says in verse 13. It says, now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished. Why are they astonished? They're looking at Peter and John, they're saying, wait a second, these guys are uneducated. There is no theological education, there's no training, there is no explanation for what we're seeing in this moment apart from these individuals being a part of the echo of the kingdom of God now playing out before us. Like, the only way we can explain who these men are is by God working in their lives. And so they are perplexed by this, right? They're astonished by this. Like, what in the world is happening? In fact, they recognize that they had been with Jesus. And then verse 14 says, they go on. But seeing the man who was healed standing beside them, they had nothing to say in opposition. They're looking at this guy, this like 40-year-old guy, and they're like, what do we do with this, right? How do we explain this away? Here's this guy, and everybody knows who he is. Everybody saw him sit by the gate in Jerusalem. Everybody knows that this guy's been healed. There's nothing we can say about this. And then verse 15, it says, but when they commanded them to leave the council, they conferred with one another, saying, what do we do with these men? See, there's this problem, right? We're seeing things, we're observing things, we're recognizing the power and the presence of God in this moment. So what do we do with this? How do we handle this? Something has to be decided in this, right? And then it says, for that a notable sign has been performed through them is evident to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. So here they are. And they're realizing we cannot deny the reality of God moving here. I want you just to notice that these leaders could deny the teachings of Jesus. They could do that. They could deny the teachings on a philosophical level. They could deny the teachings of Jesus. But they could not deny the outcome of a life that is spent with or impacted by Jesus himself. There was no denying this. Intellectually, cognitively, they might disagree, but when they're sitting in front of these individuals, there is nothing that they can argue with. Why? Because they're viewing the echoes of God's voice. They're experiencing the sound, the rushing wind of God. They're being blown by the pneuma, by the ruach in this moment. And it causes them to respond. What do we do with these men? We can't deny this. Evidently, somebody didn't deny this, because in this circumstance, if you think about this, I love this part of it. If you think about what's happening here, they send Peter and John out of the room. So how do we know the conversation that took place in the room if Peter and John were in the room and there were no other Christians in the room? Other than the conclusion that somebody in this room at some point decided that they believed in Jesus enough to share this conversation that was happening among the religious elite in this moment. Based on what we're reading, somebody, in all likelihood, believed. The point is this. At some point, a conclusion has to be drawn. We have to make a decision around these things. We get pushed to the point where a decision has to be made. There's no denying it. My friend I mentioned earlier, a couple weeks ago, we're hanging out together, and as we're standing talking, he goes, hey, I got to talk to you about something. He goes, I just sort of had this recent epiphany. I've just sort of realized some things. And he said, I just have come to realize that it's requiring as much faith for me to be an atheist as it would for me to be a follower of Jesus. And I just looked at him, I said, man, that is beautiful. It's amazing. And I said, how have you landed on this? He said, I've just been thinking about my atheism and thinking about all these things, and I'm realizing I have to place faith in my atheism in order to be the person that I've been. And he said, I'm not sure yet what to do with this, but he realizes a decision has to be made. And ultimately, that leads to two questions that I'll wrap up with tonight. Two questions that I think are essential for us to answer for ourselves. The first one is this: what are you going to do with Jesus? And then what is Jesus going to do with you? That's really what this is about. What are you going to do with Jesus? And then what is Jesus going to do with you? What are you going to do with Jesus? I mean, here he is. He's being presented to you. He's in front of you. There's a supremacy. Are you going to allow Jesus to supersede the values that you've been living by? Are you going to allow him to reshape the roadmap that you're following? He's going to amend the architectural drawings upon which you are building your life. Are you going to acknowledge the supremacy of Jesus and trust him and allow him to supersede those things? What are you going to do with Jesus? And then probably the bigger question for most of us in this room tonight is this: and what are you going to let Jesus do with you? Is Jesus going to be limited to occasional comfort? Or moments of calm in the middle of life's chaos? Or will you move that step further and become an echo of the wind yourself? Will you become a tool in the hands of this craftsman that is renewing the world? Will you be one who is participating with God in the renewal of all things? Will you be a living example of the power of God, the presence of God displayed for people? Will you be that echo in a classroom that you walk into, a job site that you walk on, an office that you interact with, a neighborhood you hang out in, a lake that you play on? Like wherever you go, will you be the echo of the wind of God? That's the question. What will you do with Jesus? And then what are you going to let Jesus do with you? Would you stand with me? I'll keep this pretty simple tonight. This week, may you be men and women who are echoes, sounds reverberating from heaven. May your lives be a display of God's power and God's presence in the places you go. May you be common men and common women who astonish people because God is with you. Amen.